The Assyrian Empire stood at the peak of its power. Under King Sennacherib, its armies had crushed nation after nation, leaving cities burned, people exiled, and hope erased. Now, that unstoppable force had arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. Surrounding the city was an army said to number 185,000 soldiers, battle-hardened warriors confident that victory was only a matter of time. From the outside, Jerusalem looked small, vulnerable, and outmatched. Its walls seemed insignificant compared to Assyria's military might, but the threat was not only physical. The Assyrians unleashed psychological warfare, shouting threats meant to break morale, spreading fear among the people, and boldly mocking the God of Israel. Their message was clear: no God had ever stopped Assyria before, and Jerusalem would be no different. Inside the city, tension filled the air. Every sound from beyond the walls carried dread. Every insult tested faith. Would Jerusalem fall like so many others? Would its God prove powerless against the greatest empire of the ancient world? History had one answer. Scripture had another. What happened next would become one of the most astonishing moments ever recorded, an event so sudden, so overwhelming, that it would reshape how power, pride, and faith were understood for generations. It was not a clash of swords. It was not a heroic last stand. It was something far more unexpected. Tonight, we step into that moment. We explore the night when human arrogance met divine authority, when fear gave way to faith, and when an entire army vanished without a single battle being fought. If you're ready to uncover how this dramatic story unfolds and what it still teaches us, today make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future stories. Let's begin the journey into one of the most powerful accounts of deliverance ever told. Inside Jerusalem, while the vast Assyrian army pressed closer and fear echoed beyond the walls, the city was led by a man very different from the kings who had ruled before him. King Hezekiah did not rise to power through conquest or intimidation, nor did he rely on alliances with stronger nations to secure his throne. His strength came from a quieter, deeper source, an unwavering commitment to the God of Israel that shaped every decision he made long before the crisis ever began. Hezekiah's reign marked a turning point in Judah's history. In an era when many rulers tolerated or even promoted idol worship, he chose a different path. From the earliest days of his rule, he worked to restore true worship, reopening the temple that had been neglected and calling the people back to spiritual faithfulness. Sacred spaces were cleansed, forgotten traditions were renewed, and a sense of purpose slowly returned to Jerusalem. This was not merely religious reform. It was the rebuilding of a nation's identity, grounded in trust rather than fear. Yet Hezekiah's faith never drifted into passivity. He understood that belief did not mean neglecting responsibility. As the Assyrian threat grew more real, he quietly prepared the city for what might come. Jerusalem's walls were reinforced, towers strengthened, and defenses carefully organized. One of his most remarkable achievements was securing the city's water supply through an underground tunnel, ensuring that even under siege, Jerusalem would not be cut off from life itself. These preparations were not acts of panic, but expressions of wisdom, shaped by the conviction that faith and action must walk together. When Assyria finally arrived, bringing with it overwhelming numbers and relentless intimidation, the contrast between the two leaders became unmistakable. Sennacherib trusted in power, reputation, and fear. Hezekiah trusted in something unseen. While threats rang out beyond the walls, Hezekiah refused to answer them with boasts or counter-threats. Instead, he turned inward, guiding his people toward courage rooted in confidence rather than force. His words to the city were steady and calm, reminding them that strength did not belong solely to armies and weapons, but to the presence of God among them. As pressure mounted, Hezekiah did what defined him most clearly as a king. He went to the temple, not to display authority, but to lay down control. The letters filled with threats were brought before God in prayer, not as a sign of desperation, but as an act of surrender. He acknowledged the reality of the danger without denying the power of God, seeking not personal survival or political victory, but the honor of the one he served. In that moment, leadership was no longer about command, but about humility. This posture of trust did more than shape Hezekiah's response. It shaped the spirit of the entire city. Jerusalem did not collapse under fear, nor did it rush into reckless action. The people waited, held together by the example of a king whose faith had been tested long before it was challenged publicly. The siege revealed what had already been built within the walls, a foundation not dependent on alliances, numbers, or reputation, but on steadfast trust. As the night drew near and uncertainty hung heavily over Jerusalem, it became clear that this story was not simply about an empire threatening a city. It was about the difference between power claimed and power entrusted, between pride that demands control and faith that releases it. And in that quiet space between fear and hope, the stage was set for an outcome no army could have predicted, one that would forever define the legacy of King Hezekiah and the God in whom he placed his trust. As Jerusalem held its breath behind fortified walls and the Assyrian camp stretched endlessly across the surrounding hills, the next move did not come in the form of weapons or siege engines. It came through a voice. Sent by King Sennacherib, the Assyrian envoy Rabshakeh stepped forward, positioning himself where his words could travel far beyond the city gates. This was no ordinary messenger. He was chosen carefully, trained not only in diplomacy, but in intimidation, and he understood that fear, once planted, could weaken a city more effectively than any army. Rabshakeh spoke in Hebrew, the language of the people. It was a deliberate choice. He could have used Aramaic, the language of officials and negotiations, but he wanted every man, woman, and child listening from the walls to understand him clearly. His goal was not conversation. It was disruption. By speaking directly to the people, he bypassed the leadership of Jerusalem and aimed straight for the heart of public confidence. His voice carried with calm assurance, as if the outcome was already decided. He questioned the wisdom of trusting King Hezekiah and mocked the very foundation on which the city stood. What good, he asked, was faith when faced with overwhelming power? What had belief accomplished for the countless cities that had already fallen before Assyria? One by one, he listed the nations that had resisted and failed, reminding the people that their gods had not saved them. The implication was unmistakable. Jerusalem's God would prove no different. The message was carefully constructed, blending logic with threat, persuasion with certainty. Rabshakeh did not shout in anger. He spoke with confidence, presenting surrender as a reasonable, even generous. Alternative. He painted images of survival and stability if the city would only abandon its resistance. His words were meant to sound practical, almost compassionate, while quietly stripping away hope. In doing so, he challenged not only the city's defenses, but its faith, seeking to replace trust with doubt. What made the moment especially tense was the silence that followed. Hezekiah's officials, standing nearby, urged Rabshakeh to speak in another language, fearful of the effect his words might have on the people. But Rabshakeh refused. He wanted the walls to hear him. He wanted uncertainty to spread through the streets of Jerusalem, to seep into homes and minds. Every sentence was designed to make faith feel foolish and surrender feel inevitable. Inside the city, the people listened. The temptation to respond, to argue, or to panic must have been overwhelming. Yet Hezekiah had already given clear instruction. No one was to answer. And so Jerusalem remained silent. This silence was not weakness. It was restraint. It was a collective decision to trust the path their king had chosen, even as doubt pressed hard against their resolve. In that quiet, the contrast between Assyria and Jerusalem became sharper than ever. One side relying on words meant to dominate, the other holding fast to faith without reply. Rabshakeh's speech revealed more than Assyria's confidence. It exposed the limits of human arrogance. By equating the God of Israel with lifeless idols, he crossed a line that went beyond politics or conquest. What he intended as intimidation became, unknowingly, a direct challenge to divine authority. His words echoed through the city, but they also rose beyond it, setting the stage for a response far greater than any human voice. As Rabshakeh withdrew to the camp, the siege entered a new phase. No arrows had been fired. No walls had been breached. Yet the battle had already begun and fought in the unseen realm of faith, resolve, and trust. Jerusalem stood quiet beneath the night sky, carrying the weight of those words, while beyond the walls an empire waited confidently for a victory it believed was certain. What neither Rabshakeh nor his king could foresee was that their greatest weapon fear had failed, and that their challenge had already summoned a power beyond their understanding. When Rabshakeh's voice finally faded into the distance, and the echoes of his threats lingered over Jerusalem, King Hezekiah did not respond with speeches, counter-arguments, Kothian demons, or displays of power. Instead, he turned away from the walls and walked toward the temple. The noise of intimidation was met with silence, and the weight of human fear was carried into a place set apart for something higher. In that moment, Hezekiah's leadership revealed its deepest foundation, not control, but surrender. The king entered the temple not as a ruler demanding answers, but as a servant seeking direction. He removed the symbols of royal confidence and clothed himself in humility, acknowledging that the crisis before Jerusalem could not be solved by strategy alone. The threats delivered by Assyria were real, the army outside the city was vast, and the danger was undeniable. Yet Hezekiah understood that the true struggle was not only against soldiers and siege, but against despair and doubt. Before any action could be taken, clarity had to be restored where fear had taken hold. Hezekiah did not isolate himself in this moment. He sent his most trusted officials to the prophet Isaiah, a man whose voice had long spoken truth in times of national uncertainty. This decision was deliberate. Isaiah did not represent political leverage or military reinforcement. He represented divine insight. Through him, Hezekiah sought not reassurance shaped by comfort, but truth shaped by purpose. The message carried to Isaiah reflected the condition of the city: distress, vulnerability, and a recognition that human strength had reached its limits. As Isaiah received the message, the response was swift and steady. There was no panic in his words, no hesitation in his confidence. The assurance that came through him did not dismiss the danger, but it redefined it. The God who had seen the rise of Assyria was not intimidated by it. The words delivered back to Hezekiah carried a promise that cut through fear with quiet authority. Jerusalem would not fall. The invading army would not cross the threshold of the city. Not a single arrow would be released against its walls. When Hezekiah received this message, the focus of the story shifted. The siege was no longer defined by Assyria's power, but by God's intention. Yet even with this promise, the king did not retreat into passive expectation. He returned again to the temple, this time carrying the written threats sent by Sennacherib himself. The letter was spread before God, not as a symbol of panic, but as an act of trust. Every accusation, every boast, every attempt to diminish faith was placed openly in prayer. Hezekiah's prayer revealed the heart of his leadership. He acknowledged the strength of Assyria and the destruction it had caused, refusing to minimize reality. At the same time, he recognized the difference between lifeless idols and the living God. His request was not framed around personal survival or political victory, but around meaning. He asked that deliverance would reveal truth, that all who witnessed it would understand where real authority resided. This moment marked a turning point not only for the king, but for the city itself. The people of Jerusalem, waiting behind the walls, now stood between two voices. One had spoken loudly and confidently, promising defeat. Sufficient. The other spoke quietly, offering assurance without spectacle. The difference was profound. Fear demands immediate reaction. Faith invites patience. Isaiah's words carried more than comfort. They carried certainty. The promise was specific, leaving no room for ambiguity. The enemy would return the way it came. The city would stand untouched. What lay ahead would not depend on numbers, weapons, or reputation, but on a decision already made in the Templiar decision to trust fully in the power that does not need to announce itself. As night approached, Jerusalem remained surrounded, the Assyrian camp still vast and confident. Yet something had changed. The battle had moved beyond the visible. In the quiet spaces of prayer and prophecy, an outcome had already been declared. The city waited, not with reckless optimism, but with grounded confidence, holding on to a promise that would soon redefine history and reveal the limits of human power when faced with divine authority. As night settled over the Assyrian camp, a heavy silence replaced the noise of intimidation that had filled the air only hours before, and Jerusalem remained still behind its walls, unaware that the turning point of its fate had already begun. The army of Sennacherib, so confident in its numbers and past victories, rested under the assumption that dawn would bring surrender. Yet the story was about to move in a direction no strategist could have predicted. There was no clash of weapons, no breach of gates, and no dramatic charge across the fields. Only a sudden and unseen intervention that unfolded beyond human control. By morning, the vast force that had once seemed unstoppable was gone, not defeated by another army, but silenced in a way that left no room for boasting or explanation through ordinary means. The impact of that night rippled far beyond the camp itself, because what occurred challenged the very logic on which the Assyrian campaign had been built. Sennacherib had trusted in overwhelming strength, by psychological pressure, and the belief that every nation's god eventually fell silent before imperial power. Yet Jerusalem stood untouched, its walls unscarred, and its people spared the horrors they had braced themselves to endure. When daylight revealed the outcome, the contrast was striking, as the city that had been mocked now stood intact, while the army that had mocked it lay broken and powerless to continue its mission. The silence spoke louder than any proclamation, turning fear into awe and despair into stunned relief. News of what happened spread quickly, not through official announcements or grand ceremonies, but through the sheer impossibility of denying the result. The same king who had sent threats and boasts now withdrew, returning to his land without the triumph he had promised his followers or the humiliation he had planned for Jerusalem. His retreat carried a message as clear as any victory banner, because it revealed the limits of human authority when it confronts something greater than itself. The city that had refused to surrender its faith had not needed to lift a sword, and that absence of battle made the outcome even more powerful, as it could not be attributed to chance or clever tactics. For the people of Jerusalem, the meaning of that night would linger long after the danger had passed. They remembered the fear, the insults shouted in their own language, and the quiet determination of a king who chose prayer over panic. And in the aftermath, they understood that survival itself had become a testimony. The walls that had held firm were no longer just stone and timber, but symbols of trust rewarded and faith tested under pressure. Every sunrise after that night carried a renewed awareness that their future had been preserved not by strength they could measure, but by confidence placed beyond what they could see. The story did not end with the retreat of Sennacherib, because its lesson continued to echo wherever power tempted rulers to believe they were untouchable. It reminded later generations that history is not shaped by force alone, and that moments of true transformation often arrive quietly, without warning, when human certainty gives way to something far greater. Jerusalem's deliverance became a defining chapter, not because of spectacle, but because of restraint, faith, and the unexpected reversal of expectations. In the stillness after the storm, the city stood as living proof that some victories are won without a fight, and that the most decisive moments in history can occur in a single night, unseen yet unforgettable. This final chapter of the story does more than close a historical episode. It lifts the curtain on a truth that echoes far beyond the walls of ancient Jerusalem. The sudden collapse of Assyria's campaign revealed that even the greatest empires move within limits they do not control. Biblical records describe the deliverance with quiet certainty, while Assyrian inscriptions, notably Sennacherib's own annals, conspicuously avoid claiming victory over Jerusalem, an absence that speaks as loudly as any admission. Archaeology, from reliefs to fortification remains, confirms the setting and scale of events, grounding faith within history rather than placing it apart from it. Together, these sources form a rare convergence where text, stone, and memory align, reinforcing the message that power is never absolute when measured against divine authority. What made this moment endure was not merely the outcome, but the way it overturned expectations. The world of that era believed survival belonged to the strongest army, the cleverest strategy, or the loudest threats. Yet Jerusalem was spared without relying on alliances, reinforcements, or force, and this reversal reshaped how the story was remembered. It taught that humility can stand firm where arrogance collapses, and that faith is not passive resignation, but a deliberate choice made under pressure. Hezekiah's response did not erase fear, but it redirected it, transforming anxiety into trust and uncertainty into resolve. Over time, this event became more than a national memory. It became a lesson retold whenever people faced forces that seemed overwhelming. It reminded listeners that human strength, while impressive, is fragile when it assumes independence from moral responsibility and spiritual truth. Empires rise, inscriptions boast, and monuments celebrate power. Yet history repeatedly shows how quickly such confidence fades. The deliverance of Jerusalem stands as a counter-narrative, one where restraint proves stronger than aggression and reliance proves wiser than self-sufficiency. For modern audiences, the story still speaks with clarity. It challenges the instinct to trust only what can be measured, counted, or displayed, and instead invites reflection on where true security is found. Faith here is not presented as an escape from reality, but as a deeper engagement with it, recognizing that outcomes are shaped not only by visible forces but by values, choices, and trust placed beyond human limits. The lesson is timeless because the struggle between pride and humility, fear and trust, remains unchanged. Kabistams and thank you for listening and journeying through this remarkable story with us. If you found meaning, insight, or inspiration here, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, explored, and shared with others who are searching for depth beyond the surface of history.